In the depths of history, amidst the chaos and uncertainty of the ancient world, there emerged a philosophy that spoke to the very essence of human existence. Stoicism, born in the streets of Athens and refined by minds like Zeno of Citium, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, offered a path to inner peace and resilience in the face of adversity. At its core, Stoicism teaches us that while we may not always control the events that unfold around us, we do have control over our perceptions, judgments, and actions. Imagine standing on the shores of the Aegean Sea, gazing out at the vast expanse of water stretching to the horizon. The Stoics likened our minds to this sea, capable of great turmoil and turbulence, yet also possessing the potential for profound stillness and clarity. Just as a skilled sailor navigates the waves with skill and determination, so too can we navigate the storms of life with Stoic wisdom as our compass. Chapter 2: The Power of Perception. Central to the teachings of Stoicism is the notion that our perception shapes our reality. The Stoics believed that it is not the events themselves that cause us distress, but rather our judgments about those events. Consider the story of Epictetus, a former slave who rose to become one of the most revered Stoic philosophers. Despite enduring unimaginable hardships, including physical abuse and deprivation of freedom, Epictetus found solace in the power of his own mind. In his seminal work, The Enchiridion, Epictetus writes, "Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of them." These words echo through the ages, reminding us that our interpretation of events is ultimately within our control. By adopting a Stoic perspective, we can train ourselves to see challenges as opportunities for growth, setbacks as stepping stones to success, and hardships as tests of character. Chapter 3: Cultivating Virtue. At the heart of Stoicism lies the concept of virtue, or arit in ancient Greek. For the Stoics, virtue is not merely a theoretical ideal, but a practical guide for living a life of purpose and meaning. Drawing inspiration from the wisdom of Socrates and the teachings of the Stoic school, we can embark on a journey of self-discovery and self-mastery. The Stoic virtues, wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance, serve as pillars upon which we can build a life of integrity and excellence. Like a sculptor chiseling away at a block of marble, we can refine our character through diligent practice and self-reflection. As Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one." Chapter 4: Harnessing the Power of Choice. In every moment, we are faced with a choice, to react impulsively to external events or to respond with mindful intentionality. This fundamental principle of Stoicism is encapsulated in the concept of the dichotomy of control. While we may not always control the circumstances of our lives, we do have control over how we choose to perceive and act upon those circumstances. Consider the story of Cato the Younger, a Roman statesman renowned for his unwavering commitment to Stoic principles. In the face of tyranny and corruption, Cato remained steadfast in his pursuit of virtue, even unto death. His example reminds us that true freedom lies not in external circumstances, but in the mastery of our own minds. Chapter 5: Embracing Impermanence. In the grand tapestry of existence, change is the only constant. The Stoics understood this immutable truth and counseled acceptance of the transitory nature of all things. Whether we are confronted with loss, failure, or uncertainty, Stoicism teaches us to greet each moment with equanimity and grace. The Stoic philosopher Seneca famously wrote, "We are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more from imagination than from reality." These words remind us that our fears and anxieties are often the products of our own minds, rather than objective realities. By cultivating a mindset of acceptance and detachment, we can find peace amidst the flux of life. Chapter 6: Living in Accordance with Nature. At its core, Stoicism is a philosophy of alignment with the natural order of the cosmos. Just as a tree bends and sways with the wind, so too must we learn to adapt and flow with the currents of life. By embracing the interconnectedness of all things and living in harmony with nature, we can find serenity and fulfillment. The Stoic concept of sympathia underscores the interconnectedness of the universe, reminding us that we are but tiny threads woven into the fabric of existence. As Marcus Aurelius observed, the universe is change, our life is what our thoughts make it. By attuning our minds to the rhythms of nature, we can find solace in the midst of chaos and clarity in the face of uncertainty. Chapter 7: The Stoic Way Forward. As we journey through the labyrinth of life, let us heed the timeless wisdom of the Stoics and forge our own path of inner strength and resilience. Let us cultivate clarity of mind, courage of spirit, and integrity of character, knowing that true happiness lies not in the attainment of external goals, but in the cultivation of inner virtue. In the words of Epictetus, he is a wise man who does not grieve for the things which he has not, but rejoices for those which he has. Let us rejoice in the gifts of the present moment, embracing each day with gratitude and humility. For in the crucible of adversity, we discover the true measure of our strength and the depth of our humanity. May we walk the path of Stoic clarity with unwavering resolve and steadfast purpose, knowing that within us lies the power to transcend our circumstances and embrace the fullness of life's rich tapestry. And may we, like the Stoic sages of old, leave behind a legacy of wisdom, virtue, and inner peace for generations to come. We are Stoics. We are seekers of truth, champions of virtue, and architects of our own destiny. Let us embrace the challenge of living in accordance with nature, knowing that in the crucible of adversity, we discover the true measure of our strength and the depth of our humanity. Chapter 8: The Stoic Legacy. As we draw near the culmination of our exploration into Stoicism and its profound implications for goal-setting and achieving ambitions, it is fitting to reflect on the rich legacy of this ancient philosophy. Stoicism, with its emphasis on self-mastery, virtue, and resilience, continues to resonate across the centuries, offering timeless wisdom for navigating the complexities of human existence. In this intellectual conclusion, we shall delve deeper into the core tenets of Stoicism, examining its enduring relevance in the modern world and exploring new approaches that integrate Stoic philosophy to cultivate effective and virtuous leaders. Through a synthesis of historical insights, philosophical reflections, and practical applications, we shall illuminate the transformative power of Stoicism and its capacity to inspire individuals to lead lives of purpose and meaning. The Stoic ethos, our philosophy for life. At its essence, Stoicism is not merely a set of abstract principles or philosophical doctrines, but a way of life, an ethos that informs every aspect of human existence. Rooted in the teachings of ancient philosophers such as Zeno of Citium, Epictetus, and Seneca, Stoicism offers a comprehensive framework for living with clarity, integrity, and resilience. Central to the Stoic ethos is the concept of arete, or virtue, which encompasses wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. By cultivating these virtues, individuals can aspire towards eudaimonia, or flourishing, the highest good according to Stoic philosophy. Moreover, Stoicism emphasizes the importance of living in accordance with nature, recognizing the interconnectedness of all things and embracing the inevitability of change. Through the practice of self-examination, mindfulness, and ethical discernment, Stoics seek to attain inner tranquility and freedom from the tyranny of destructive emotions. By recognizing the dichotomy of control and focusing their efforts on what is within their power, Stoics are able to navigate the vicissitudes of life with equanimity and grace. Stoicism and goal setting, the pursuit of excellence. In the realm of goal setting and ambition, Stoicism offers invaluable insights into the nature of success, failure, and fulfillment. Unlike conventional approaches that prioritize external achievements or material possessions, Stoicism encourages individuals to cultivate virtues such as wisdom, courage, and resilience as the true markers of excellence. Rather than fixating on outcomes or results beyond their control, Stoics focus their attention on the process of self-improvement and ethical action. By setting goals that align with their values and principles, individuals can pursue a life of purpose and integrity, irrespective of external circumstances. Moreover, Stoicism teaches us to embrace adversity as an opportunity for growth and self-discovery. Instead of shying away from challenges or setbacks, Stoics confront them with stoic fortitude and perseverance, knowing that true strength arises from overcoming obstacles and adversity. In the pursuit of goals, Stoics also emphasize the importance of ethical decision-making and moral integrity. By adhering to principles of justice, honesty, and compassion, individuals can navigate the complexities of leadership with integrity and grace, inspiring trust and respect in others. Integrating Stoicism into leadership development. In an era marked by uncertainty, volatility, and rapid change, the need for effective and virtuous leadership has never been greater. In this context, Stoicism offers a compelling paradigm for leadership development, grounded in principles of wisdom, courage, and ethical stewardship. By cultivating a Stoic mindset, leaders can navigate the complexities of leadership with clarity, resilience, and moral integrity. Drawing upon the insights of Stoic philosophers such as Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, leaders can cultivate self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and ethical discernment, empowering them to make wise and principled decisions in the face of adversity. Moreover, Stoicism encourages leaders to embrace a servant leadership ethos, characterized by humility, empathy, and a commitment to the common good. By prioritizing the well-being of their teams and organizations over personal ambition or self-interest, Stoic leaders can inspire trust, loyalty, and collaboration, fostering a culture of excellence and innovation. In the realm of organizational leadership, Stoicism also offers valuable lessons for cultivating resilience and adaptability in the face of change. By embracing the Stoic virtues of courage, resilience, and acceptance, leaders can navigate uncertainty and volatility with equanimity and grace, fostering a culture of resilience and agility within their organizations. The Stoic legacy, embracing the challenge of virtue. As we reflect on the enduring legacy of Stoicism and its profound implications for goal-setting and achieving ambitions, let us embrace the challenge of virtue with humility, courage, and grace. In a world marked by uncertainty, complexity, and moral ambiguity, Stoicism offers a beacon of clarity, integrity, and resilience, a timeless philosophy for living with purpose and meaning. In the words of Marcus Aurelius, waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. Let us heed the call to virtue with unwavering resolve and steadfast purpose, knowing that true happiness lies not in the attainment of external goals, but in the cultivation of inner excellence. As we embark on the journey ahead, let us walk the path of Stoic clarity with humility, courage, and compassion, knowing that within us lies the power to transcend our circumstances and embrace the fullness of life's rich tapestry. And may we, like the Stoic sages of old, leave behind a legacy of wisdom, virtue, and inner peace for generations to come.